There are ways to structure a literature essay so that you're guaranteed to get top grades. Your most important element is at the beginning. It's called the thesis statement. And basically what that means is you have to work out, what does the author want to do with this text? What are they trying to prove? What are they trying to explore? I'm going to use Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet because those are the most common Shakespeare plays that people study, to illustrate what I mean. So let's start with Macbeth. We know that Shakespeare is fascinated by the supernatural because King James is fascinated by the supernatural. We know that he's writing this play as a cautionary tale, warning the nobles against rebellion against King James. You might not know that this play is first performed not at the Globe, not at the theatre, but at St James's Palace, at his court. It's put on for King James with the nobles there. So they are his main audience and therefore his main message is political. Another thing you may not know is that Shakespeare, many people believe, it's not proven, was a Catholic, and we've just had the Gunpowder Plot, a Catholic assassination attempt to kill King James. So all the stuff about kingship in the play is there to teach King James to be a better, more merciful king, not to go like Macbeth and become super violent and take revenge. So that's an aspect that people often don't study. It's in my guide if you're interested, but that's another part of your thesis statement. Every text you ever study is also obsessed with the role of women. And this is a fantastic gift to you because you can discuss this in two ways. You can look at what the expectations of women were in the society at the time, and then you look at the author and say, well, did they agree with society or not? And so that's really easy to do with Lady Macbeth and the witches. They're excluded from power because Lady Macbeth can't give birth to a kid that lives, and obviously the witches are super ugly. They can't get married. That's the only way to get ahead in this society as a woman. And so you can easily have this discussion around what Shakespeare believes about the role of women. Does he use Lady Macbeth just to show that women are inherently evil, just like Adam and Eve, or that they're not, that they're actually fully fledged individuals who should be treated in the same way as men? Now, you can decide which way you want to go there, but having that discussion is always going to be part of your thesis statement. Now, if we flip to Romeo and Juliet, exactly the same issue applies with the patriarchal society. You know, if Juliet was able to choose her own husband, if her life wasn't controlled by her father, just like every woman's lives is controlled by the men in their lives, then the tragedy would not have unfolded. So that's one possibility. The other possibility in the thesis statement is everybody already knew the story of Romeo and Juliet because it was a famous Italian poem that had been famously translated into English, and the poem was a cautionary tale, there it is again, to parents about giving freedom to their teenage children. It was an anti-teenage poem. It said that, you know, teenagers become hormonal, they'll rebel against their parents, and if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile, they'll start getting married behind your back, and that's where the tragedy occurs because of the impulsive nature of the teenagers who are hormonal and obsessed with sex. That's the message of the poem. In the play, it's quite different. You could argue Shakespeare is a lot of the time on the side of the lovers and not against them. You don't have to argue that. Of course, you could argue that, no, it is a cautionary tale to parents. But that goes in your thesis statement, whichever you believe Shakespeare's point of view is about that. We also have this real discussion about masculinity. And a lot of the tragedy, if not all of the tragedy, is caused by this violent attraction to masculine behaviour. Or I should rephrase that, this attraction to masculine behaviour which is violent in pursuit of honour. So the whole feud is about family honour. Mercutio's intervention is about honour. Tybalt's intervention is about honour. It's all about this masculine pursuit of honour through violence. And obviously, because that's what leads to the tragedy, we can argue that Shakespeare is deeply critical of that. Both plays, of course, are an entertainment. Romeo and Juliet more so because it's performed at the Globe for an audience that's interested in the theme of love. It's there to entertain, it's there to make you weep. Now, once you understand these elements of your thesis, you're going to pick at least 3 of these to be relevant to whatever the essay is, and that's going to be your first paragraph. You can have more than 3, of course. And this isn't a massive paragraph, it's short. So, for example, if the question is about violence in Macbeth, your thesis statement might say, Shakespeare introduces the masculine violence of Macbeth in order to write a cautionary tale advising the nobles not to commit regicide, explore the difference between the genders, and ask the question whether women will naturally resort to extreme violence in order to achieve power because they are excluded from power in a patriarchal society, and to explore the use of violence by a reigning king in order to persuade King James to be merciful in his treatment of Catholic rebels. So that was a 3-part thesis. It's only written in about 3 sentences. It's not massive, but it acts as your essay plan. Every time you write a paragraph, you know to come back to the 3 things you put in your thesis. And so each paragraph is going to construct an argument that relates back to the 3 things you said was most important about that theme or character in the play or any other text you're studying. Students often ask, how many paragraphs should I write? Now, I've just illustrated a paragraph length there because if I say I want you to write 6 to 8 paragraphs, some people will write 60-word paragraphs and some people will write a 200-word paragraph. So it doesn't actually help. So instead, the best way to think about this is how many points in the play do I have to cover? Now, this is a brilliant thing about the structure I'm going to propose to you. Every author deals with a character or a theme chronologically. And by that I mean through the acts or through the chapters as you go, their opinion changes. And that is a gift to you as an essay writer because you just have to pick 6 to 8 key moments for that character or theme and just deal with them chronologically as they appear in the play or the text. Now you'll choose whether to have 6 or 8 based on how many words you can write. So it is very difficult, but not impossible, to get a grade 9 with 700 words. So you need to make sure that you can write at least that much in your time limit. Typically, grade 8 and 9 answers are around 900 to 1100 words long. So if you can write that much, well, you're going to pick 8 moments probably. If you can't write that much, you're going to pick 6 moments. And each of those moments will be a new paragraph in your essay. For each key moment, you need a key quotation. So the next thing students want to know is how many quotations do they have to analyse in mega detail? And my advice is just to do that once. Now, there are 2 choices here. You can pick the quotation that you know is going to be relevant to that character. So if I'm writing about Macbeth, I know my earliest chronological quotation is going to be where Macbeth unseams MacDonald from the nave to the chops, because I'm going to be able to discuss Macbeth's bravery, his nobility, but also his bloodlust. This for me is a turning point. And why that's relevant to you is you're thinking strategically, where am I going to start with my top quotation? Can I prepare the analysis for it because I know it's going to be relevant to most essays? In Romeo and Juliet, I'm going to take something from Samson and Gregory. Either my naked weapon is out or his comments about putting the maidens to the wall. Why am I going to do that? Because it shows that masculine violence is tied to misogyny. masculine mistreatment of women, which for me is one of the major themes of the play. Now, both those quotations come from the beginning, so that I'm going to be able to move through the play chronologically, and I've chosen the quotations because I know I'm going to be able to adapt them to almost any question. Okay, so that's your tactic for structuring your first paragraph after the thesis statement. Now you have two choices. You can do quite an extensive language analysis of that quote because you've already prepared it and you know it's going to be relevant to most essays, or there's a theme that will be relevant to every essay for every text that you write about in this exam. And that is the role of women. If you take a feminist perspective, all these texts are written at a time when we had patriarchal societies and women were excluded from power. So there's always going to be that discussion as to whether the author is on the side of women or favours society's exclusion of women. If you're able to write 1100 words in the essay, then obviously you can explore both of those, that quote from the beginning and also the quote that leads to the patriarchal analysis, the feminist perspective. Why don't I want you to explore more quotations in that detail? Because the other part of a conceptualized response is building an argument. And that means you need enough words in your essay to go through those 6 or 8 key moments. Now, many students make the mistake of introducing context as a paragraph on its own. And do not do that. Examiners hate it, I hate it. And it's for this reason. It doesn't lead to the flow of an argument. If you're writing an argument about a theme or a character, then you're only going to use context where it's relevant to prove your point of view. And to do that, you need to drop little bits of context into your paragraphs like an embedded quotation. So context just slips in, it's not a paragraph on its own. Don't do it. Right, the next thing you need is to prove to the examiner that you are exploratory. Well, how do you do that in the structure of your essay? You need to pick one of these ideas, and I'll go back to the patriarchal society again because it's easy, where you explore more than one point of view. So let's do that with Romeo and Juliet. We're looking at the patriarchal society. We can argue that Juliet is punished in the play because she is so impulsive. She is the one who forces Romeo to marry her. She does this behind her parents' back when she knows that they are looking at an arranged marriage with Paris, and therefore she creates the situation that happens. Because there is 100% guarantee that at some point in her life, when she's quite young, by the time she's 16, says Capulet, that he's going to arrange a marriage for her. So by marrying Romeo in secret, she is creating the tragedy that inevitably happens. So we could have the patriarchal view that you need to marry your daughters off young because they will betray you, they will become obsessed with their hormones and love and want to go behind your back, and then you won't be able to marry them off because they won't be virgins anymore, blah, blah, blah. Patriarchal view. However, the alternative is Shakespeare is saying, look, this patriarchal control of women is absolutely disastrous. It means that people can't marry for love. It means that they can't explore love in an innocent way. They have to leap straight to marriage because there's no sex before marriage. And you can bring in some context here. Shakespeare himself married his wife, who was 8 years older than him after he had got her pregnant. So Shakespeare's own life is a kind of rejection of the patriarchal society here. He's not living his life in the same way as Juliet has to live hers. So that gives you 2 contrasting ways of looking at Juliet. You can have one paragraph exploring that. And of course, she will always be relevant to an essay, even if it's about masculinity, because masculinity, patriarchal control, result of patriarchal control, Juliet's predicament and death. In Macbeth, you can easily discuss the patriarchal view of Lady Macbeth or the witches. And one of the key things about the witches, who of course will be relevant to any essay that you do, is that they never actually cause anything to happen. All they ever do is tell Macbeth what they know is going to happen in the future, and all the decisions around that are his. They don't control him in any way. And that actually is completely different from King James's view of witches. He believed that they could control the weather, that they could intervene and actually make things happen to you. Not so in the play. So Shakespeare's portrayal of witches here is actually, in one perspective, that they have no power at all other than foresight. Of course, you can then take the opposite view and say, no, their power is psychological in the way that they're able to influence Macbeth's mind and perhaps Lady Macbeth's mind. It's up to you, but you can see how that alternative interpretation discussion is going to be conceptualized. Now we come to the conclusion. And the advantage of working through chronologically is your conclusion obviously is going to write about the ending of the text. And that's brilliant because the author always gives you a final perspective in the end, and therefore this gives you a final perspective for your argument, for your conceptualized response. So here are some examples that you could use from Macbeth. Malcolm is crowned king, but we know from the witches that Banquo's sons, Fleance and Fleance's descendants, are going to become kings. And so we're left with the question, how will that happen? Does Shakespeare suggest that the witch's power will still carry on after the play? In other words, does evil outlast good? Alternatively, we can look at the description of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth as a butcher and a fiend-like queen and discuss whether that's an accurate portrayal of what Shakespeare thinks about them. Or we can look at the fact that we have the coronation of a Scottish king and the obvious parallels to King James and the celebration of Scottish kingship, so kind of propaganda at the end. Now, the skill of a good conclusion is that you also ask a further question that the essay hasn't yet answered, but kind of the next essay in the sequence would answer. And I've just demonstrated 3 of those for you. We find that the parents are reconciled at the end, well, those that are still living, because they blamed themselves for the tragedy. So now, when they build this golden statue to Romeo and Juliet, we can argue that Shakespeare is saying, look, the tragedy is not the fault of the teenagers. Shakespeare is going against the source poem and saying the tragedy is the fault of this patriarchal society and the fact that fathers can control the lives of their daughters. Look how destructive that is. He's also using it to show the destructive power of masculine behaviour and beliefs in honour. And so at the end, the feud is put aside and honour is in the families coming together, not violently, but peacefully. So you need to practice that structure. And if you would like a top grade essay, check out the video coming up next.